All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Allie Ryan Hansen. I'm the Communications Manager for the Oregon Department of State Lands, and I will be your moderator for this evening's session. We are recording and we'll be posting the video to the DSL YouTube page. A link to the video as well as a link to the info session from last week will be on our DSL Elliott website. The working draft of the HCP is also on the DSL Elliott website. So that is a good place for folks who maybe couldn't make it tonight to go to learn about the working draft. It is my pleasure to be welcoming you all tonight. Development of an HCP for the Elliott is essential to the Land Board's vision for the Elliott State Forest and to protecting and enhancing habitat for endangered and threatened species. We are very excited to have a working draft to be sharing with you all tonight. We have a pretty straightforward agenda. First, it's going to be an overview of the Elliott HCP working draft by ICF. Then we're going to do some project team introductions, followed by lots of time for Q&A and discussion. Please do save any questions or comments until after the presentation. If you have a question about a particular slide, we will be able to go back. We are going to use the raised hand feature to take questions. That is just under reactions at the bottom. If you click on that, there's a little thing that says raise hand. Feel free to raise your hand anytime during the presentation to get in line to ask a question. I don't think there's anybody joining us on the phone, but if you are on the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand. And if you've got any technical problems or questions, feel free to chat me directly. And finally, please be sure to keep your mic on mute. Any questions about the agenda or meeting logistics? Okay, seeing none, it is my pleasure to introduce Troy Ramick from ICF, who is working with DSL and OSU to develop the habitat conservation plan. Troy, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Allie. Again, Troy Ramick with ICF. I've been working with DSL and now OSU for a couple of years on the development of the habitat conservation plan. And tonight we have about maybe 20 to 30 minutes or so of a presentation here where I'm basically going to give a little bit of an overview of habitat conservation plans, the purpose of them, why we're doing one in the first place, in case you're new to the process. Describe the scope of the Elliott State Research Forest, HCP, and then give a little bit more detail about this working draft that is out for public review right now. So for starters, maybe we'll just kind of start at the top and talk about what an HCP is and why we're doing one for this particular process. So an HCP, essentially it outlines how an entity will comply with the Federal Endangered Species Act in situations where there are activities that are being implemented that may have an effect on federally listed species. So specifically, a habitat conservation plan is completed to support the issuance of a Section 10 incidental take permit. So those permits will be issued by either the National Marine Fisheries Service or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'll describe their role in this in a second. But the habitat conservation plan really is meant to facilitate that process. So it will be something that will be submitted to the federal agencies in support of that process. The descriptions of the information in the HCPs are really intended to provide certainty sort of across the board about how things are going to occur on the Elliott into the future. So certainty in terms of the activities that will be implemented by OSU and DSL, and certainty regarding the types of conservation actions that will be implemented for the covered species. And the HCP, because it eventually becomes part of a permit, it very much describes, and defines how the activities will occur into the future. So it gets fairly specific in many cases, and that is because it will be eventually tied to the incidental take permits under the Endangered Species Act. There are two federal agencies involved here. I mentioned them already. The National Marine Fisheries Service is involved because they have jurisdiction over marine species and most anadromous fish species. One of the covered species in this HCP is the Oregon Coast coho, and National Marine Fisheries Service has jurisdiction over that species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is also involved because they have jurisdiction over terrestrial and freshwater species, freshwater aquatic species. They have jurisdiction over the northern spotted owl and Marva marilet, which are the other two species that are proposed for coverage under this permit. So when I mention that the Habitat Conservation Plan will be utilized to facilitate issuance of endangered species permits, it really will be two different permits from two different federal agencies. Moving on to the scope of the Elliott State Research Forest, and when I say the scope of the HCP, what I really mean is, you know, the permit area, the permit term, the covered activities, and the covered species. So really, it comes down to, you know, where does the permit apply? How long will it be in place for? What activities are covered, and what species are covered by the permit? And that really, in my mind, that really kind of creates the framework or the scope of the HCP. So we'll spend just a few minutes walking through each of these. In terms of the permit area, it basically is nearly all of the common school lands within the Elliott State Forest. And so you can see those here in the map. Might be a little small, but basically the turquoise areas showing here in the map are the common school lands. Those are the areas that will be part of the research forest eventually. And so those are basically the permit areas under the HCP. You will notice that there are some Board of Forestry lands around the edges and even some interior to the Elliott. Those Board of Forestry lands are not included in this HCP. They are included in the Western Oregon State Forest HCP that the Oregon Department of Forestry is currently working on. So that's important to point out. The areas shown here in yellow are Board of Forestry lands that are involved in another HCP process, not this one. In the future, if there are land exchanges that occur between, in this case, you know, Department of State Lands and OSU and the Oregon Department of Forestry, there are provisions in each of the permits to allow for some land exchanges to occur under certain circumstances. And so that's why we are showing them on this map and including them in this kind of larger, sometimes black boundary shown as the Elliott State Forest Plan area. Now, I mentioned that you know, there is a permit term contemplated for this HCP. It is proposed to be an 80-year permit term. There's no specific amount of time that any HCP you know, needs to be in place for. It is dependent on the activities that are being covered, the species that are being covered, and the types of conservation actions that you have included in the conservation strategy. And in this case, because of the fact that we're dealing with forestry resources and it takes a while for, you know, forest to grow and to develop and change into species habitat, and that there is long-term certainty in these activities being implemented, in fact, well beyond 80 years, we've chosen an 80-year permit term for this permit. The activities that are covered by the HCP, this is pretty broad categories, but basically it's the implementation of the research design and allocations that have been devised by OSU in the proposal that they put together late last year and revised early this year. It essentially includes, you know, sort of 4 different land allocations, reserves, both the blocked conservation research watershed, which I'll show you on a map in a second, in the western portion of the forest, and then some additional reserves that are scattered in the eastern half of the forest in the management research watersheds. It also includes some areas that will be managed under intensive management, so more traditional management, and then areas that will be managed under extensive or more sort of ecological forestry management. And then across the forest, there will be riparian conservation areas, which I'll describe in more detail in a little while. Those riparian conservation areas are intended to, you know, provide protections for riparian and aquatic processes over the permit term. So the implementation of that, basically those types of management activities on the landscape are what we're covering in the HCP. And in chapter 3 of the HCP, we go into a great amount of detail about what each of those are and how they will be done. And then, of course, in support of the implementation of the research design and allocations, there will be some additional management activities, like vegetation management is a good example. There will be supporting infrastructure, both maintenance of the existing road system and in some cases, construction of some new roads to implement the research management activities. And then some additional facilities, including research facilities and also including some recreation facilities. So all of those are included in included in the HCP as covered activities. And essentially that is, we're asking ourselves the question, you know, how do those, then knowing those activities, how do those activities or will those activities have an effect on the covered species? And in this case, we're covering 3 species, which I'll mention in a moment. But before I do that, just to show you a picture of those covered activities. And I'll walk through this briefly in case it's the first time you're seeing it. Many of you have been with the process for a while, so I think you've seen it a number of times before. But essentially, what we're looking at here is the research allocations across the forest. On the western portion of the forest, this is showing up here in orange. I mentioned the conservation and research watershed, so kind of a large contiguous reserve area. And then in the eastern portion of the forest, some additional allocations. I mentioned in the previous slide what I termed sort of the scattered reserves. Those reserve areas are shown here in the green, kind of scattered around here. The intensive management areas are shown in pink, and then the extensive or ecological forestry areas are shown up here in yellow. And then you can see the riparian conservation areas on the streams and rivers across the entire planet area. So that's really the research allocations put into practice there on this slide. And then we think about those research allocations, what will be needed to manage the land in order to implement them. And then, you know, think about how they will intersect with the cover species as we currently understand them on the forest. The 3 species, as I mentioned earlier, that we are proposing to cover in this HCP are the marbled murrelet, the northern spotted owl, and the Oregon coast coho. So I'll dive into the details about kind of the sort of the effects analysis and conservation strategies for each of these in a later slide. But just for a second, want to note that really the whole kind of crux of the HCP is thinking about how do those covered activities that I showed in an earlier slide, what happens when they intersect with you know, known occupied areas or known habitat areas or expected habitat areas for these 3 species. Is there an effect on those species? We summarize and disclose that effect in the HCP and then devise a conservation strategy that will offset the impact of those effects, which is sort of the whole purpose of the process. So it very much is a species-centric exercise. I mentioned that, you know, there will be eventually permits from the 2 federal agencies, and those permits will be issued for these 3 species, assuming that everything works out. And so everything that you see in the HCP is really presented through the lens of the needs of the species. So this particular draft of the HCP is the working draft. We use the term working draft on purpose. It very much is a work in progress. What I'm showing here is just a high-level look at the different chapters of the working draft. And I think just by looking at them, you get a sense of kind of the contents of the HCP and the way that it's broken down. I sort of think of HCPs in really 3 categories. The first 3 chapters, which are the introduction, the environmental setting, including the discussion of the covered species, and the covered activities is kind of the background information or the baseline information, if you want to kind of think about it that way. And then chapters 4, 5, and 6, which I'll get into more detail about in a second, are I think kind of the heart of the HCP. That's where the analysis occurs. It's where the conservation strategy is presented. And then the latter few chapters are really about implementation of the HCP. So, you know, how will the HCP be implemented? What are the roles and responsibilities for the entities involved? We are required to figure out and disclose how much is it going to cost to implement the HCP, and then demonstrate how funding will be assured for those costs. So that's basically a brief outline of what you'll see in the working draft. If you haven't looked at it yet, we thought it would be important to put the working draft out in front of the public at this stage in the process, because you know, while a lot of work has gone into it at this stage, including a lot of coordination with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service and ODF&W, it is at a place where it is, you know, I would say sort of near complete, but still has some ways to go. And so wanted to get the public's input at this stage so that we could incorporate public you know, response and comment into the next iteration, which I'll talk about as part of next steps as we get down the road here in a minute. So I want to spend a few more minutes on what I called the heart of the HCP earlier, the chapter 4, the effects analysis, and chapter 5, the conservation strategy. And I'll then give some more information about each of the covered species with respect to those things. But first, the effect analysis, which is presented in chapter 4, that's where you'll see sort of the disclosure of the potential effects on covered species from the covered activities. So we think about that spatially, we think about that temporally, what are the activities, how are they going to be implemented on the landscape, and what happens when they intersect with species or their habitat, and we summarize that in chapter 4. It describes the potential effects on habitat. Sometimes, we make some assumptions about what those effects might be if there are some uncertainties about either the species information or information about how the covered activities might be implemented. And so we describe any assumptions that we base our analysis on in that chapter. And then it sort of includes a discussion of kind of a potential worst case scenario or worst case impacts on the covered species. And the reason for that, and we can talk about that more later if you have questions about it, but the reason for that is that we are getting permit authorization to implement the activities in a particular way. And so we don't want to get down the road during HCP implementation and find out that we sort of undercut the effects analysis in the HCP. We didn't fully disclose the effects. So we do sort of take on this worst case scenario analysis in the HCP so that we're contemplating any potential impacts to the species and that those impacts can be quantified and we can make sure that the conservation strategy is adequate to offset those effects. So in many cases, sometimes it seems like it's really bad when you read it, but in fact, we're just trying to think of every angle when we're doing the analysis. And then in chapter 5, the whole point of the conservation strategy is to demonstrate that we can offset the impact of any potential take that might occur on these listed species. So first, it includes biological goals and objectives for each species. And the biological goals and objectives are important because they become sort of the measuring stick for whether or not the HCP is being implemented successfully. And if you look at the biological objectives in this HCP, they are very focused on development of species habitat over time or maintenance and enhancement of riparian processes over time. And so you'll see that we then put together conditions on covered activities or conservation measures in that chapter that further the ability of OSU and DSL to achieve the biological goals and objectives. And so we have some specific conservation measures that will be implemented, and I'll talk about in a minute. And then in some cases, we describe some requirements for how the covered activities need to be implemented in order to minimize effects on our covered species. So that chapter is sort of broken up into three parts. The first part is conservation measures. The second part is conditions on covered activities. And then at the end, we have a discussion of the net and beneficial effects on our covered species, knowing all of that in the chapter. Lastly, I'll mention that chapter 6 describes a monitoring and adaptive management program. So, in order to understand as we go into the future through that 80-year permit term, in order to understand whether or not the HCP is being implemented successfully, we have to monitor it. And in order to know whether or not the biological objectives are being achieved, there has to be a monitoring program set up to ask those questions. And so we describe monitoring for each of the 3 covered species in chapter 6. And then there is a kind of a brief overview of an adaptive management framework that would be put in place to, obviously adapt to changes as they occur over time. So let's dive into each of the covered species just a little bit more. I have a slide on each species that I think, it's kind of a thumbnail summary of how we're thinking about the species in the HCP. So I mentioned first that there will be permits issued for each of the covered species, and we do an analysis for each of the covered species in the HCP. And actually for Oregon Coast coho, we actually do an analysis for each of the independent populations of coho that are on the Elliott. So there are 3 independent populations of coho that overlap with the Elliott, the 10-mile population, the lower Umpqua population, and the Coos population. So in the HCP, we actually have an analysis for each of those populations so that when the National Marine Fisheries Service is considering that information and considering whether or not to issue a permit based on the HCP, they'll have the information at the proper level, at the independent population level, for them to make that assessment. So when we start thinking about Oregon Coast coho on the Elliott, the first thing that is important really for all of our covered species is that 66% of the permit area is in some type of reserve, either in the conservation research watershed or in the reserves that are part of the management research watershed. So we have, going into our analysis, we know that 2/3 of the permit area is in some type of reserve that will be managed for long-term benefit of species. And so we're starting off in a really strong place from a conservation perspective for each of our covered species. Now for fish, it goes even a step further when we think about the fact that within those sort of reserves, 86% of the non-fish bearing and non-perennial streams are in either reserves or the extensive treatments, which will be managed in more of an ecological forestry type way. And so those upper water, and we're talking about the non-fish bearing and non-perennial streams, that's really those steep upper watershed areas, and the Elliott's full of those areas that are very important to the downstream fish bearing streams. And so the fact that 86% of those are in either reserve or extensive management is highly beneficial to fish species. So again, that's kind of our starting place when we're going into this analysis. And then we also know that as part of the research allocations, that there are these riparian conservation areas, which I described earlier and showed on that map. Those riparian conservation areas are essentially stream buffers on fish-bearing streams and non-fish, and some non-fish bearing streams, including reaches that have a high probability to deliver wood to fish-bearing streams. So again, with this sort of focus on stream processes, delivery of large wood into the streams is very important for Oregon Coast coho. So the inclusion of riparian conservation areas as part of the research design is sort of built additional layer of built-in protections for our fish species. And when we've done some analysis with Gordy Reeves and others at OSU have done some analysis looking at, when you think about those riparian conservation areas and the amount of wood or the percentage of the available wood that might be recruited into those stream systems, you can see for each of the independent populations, it is a very high percentage of the available wood will be recruited by those riparian conservation areas. So that's, again, that's really a starting place when we're thinking about the potential for the implementation of the research forest to affect Oregon Coast coho. So it's a highly protective design to begin with. There are some things that we have included as part of the conservation strategy to add some additional protections on or to further minimize effects on Oregon Coast coho. The first is expanding the riparian conservation areas in the Millicoma, in the lower Millicoma. You can see this Coos independent population, which is almost completely in the management research watershed on the eastern portion of the forest. The Millicoma is as part of that Coos independent population. And so in order to retain the ability to recruit wood at a higher level, we've expanded the riparian conservation areas along that area. So that is a conservation measure that you'll see in Chapter 5. And then in addition to that, there is a description of targeted riparian enhancement and in-stream habitat creation. So the riparian conservation areas that I mentioned above, on fish-bearing streams and some non-fish-bearing streams, there will also be some management in those riparian areas. And the intention of that management is to, over the course of time, develop bigger, larger wood, a more diverse forest structure. There are some areas along the riparian areas that are still sort of even-aged plantations from previous times. And so want to diversify those stands and make them so that they can perform better in the aquatic environment. And then some of the wood that will be harvested as part of that riparian management will be installed as wood installations in the streams to create habitat for coho. So all of that is captured in part of the riparian enhancement and in-stream habitat creation action or conservation measure that you'll see in Chapter 5. And then lastly, there is a condition on covered activities, particularly road activities, that describes sort of best management practices for existing roads and newly constructed roads to ensure that we can minimize, any effects from sediment transfer into fish-bearing streams over the long term. So again, some additional conservation measures and conditions on covered activities that you'll see in Chapter 5. Now on the Marble Murrelet, sort of a similar story. Again, we begin the analysis with the understanding that 84% of occupied and 90% of potential Marble Murrelet habitat is in some type of reserve. So it's largely protected in the conservation research watershed and the reserves in the management research watershed. So that's our point of entry on our Murrelet analysis. Those areas will be managed for continued habitat development into the future. So we know that there is also a long-term benefit from those reserves for Murrelets into the future. Nonetheless, we have included a couple of conditions on covered activities in Chapter 5. The first of which is just seasonal restrictions during the nesting season. So if there are management activities happening in occupied habitat at some point in the future, that condition will mean that they'll be happening outside of the nesting period. And then there is a commitment to retain in areas where there is extensive management happening in occupied Murrelet habitat, there is a commitment to retain a high proportion of the pre-harvest density in those stands, with the idea that we would be retaining a large portion of the habitat value in those areas for Murrelets into the future. And then on spotted owls, sort of a similar story. From the beginning, 80% of nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat is in reserves. So similar number to what we saw with Murrelets. 93% is in reserves and extensive. So when you think about extensive, which will continue to have some habitat benefit for northern spotted owls into the future, that's nearly all of the nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat falls into one of those two research allocations. 50% of the known northern spotted owl core areas or activity centers are in the conservation research watershed. The other 50% are in the management research watershed. In those reserve areas, similar to the Murrelet, there will be continued management to develop habitat over time. There will be a high retention of pre-harvest density in extensive areas, just like with the Murrelet. So again, trying to retain as much habitat value in those extensive harvest treatments as possible. And then also seasonal restrictions when you're operating in nesting and roosting habitat, some seasonal restrictions during the nesting season for any activities that might need to occur in there. There is still a little bit of work in progress, and I mentioned this is a working draft. And one of the things that is still under examination is, how to deal with the 50% of the northern spotted owl core areas that are in the management research watersheds. So many of those have some level of protection around them in the reserves and the extensive. There is intended to be some intensive harvest in some of those areas too. And so we're currently working on taking a closer look at some of those and trying to figure out the best way to include some provisions in the HCP to maintain at least 50% of habitat in those core areas over the course of time. And that is really just a temporal aspect to how the forest will be managed into the future. So we're just trying to figure out the best way to sort of capture that in the HCP. So still a little bit of work in progress. There's nothing in the HCP, nothing in the working draft about that yet, but there will likely be some discussion about it in a future iteration. And then last thing I'll say here about this is just wanted to highlight for a minute the unique nature of this habitat conservation plan, and something that is different than what you'll see in many other habitat conservation plans if you've been involved in those. And that is the fact that we're dealing with a research forest. There will be a lot of research done on the forest in the future that has a lot of benefits for our covered species. So we wanted to capture that, the benefit from the research within the context of the HCP. So you'll see in Chapter 5, the conservation strategy chapter, we actually describe research in the aquatic environment and research on terrestrial species as conservation measures. Because we know that the research on the covered species will benefit them certainly on the Elliott. The application of that research findings will also benefit them far beyond the Elliott, really throughout the Northwest into the future. And so there really is a specific benefit to our covered species. Now that's different from what you might see in other HCPs. It's actually rare to include the benefits of research as conservation measures in an HCP, but because we're dealing exclusively with a research forest here, we thought it was important to highlight that as part of the HCP. And that's why we've included them as conservation measures. So that concludes kind of the technical summary, but wanted to spend just a minute on next steps, and Ali will reiterate this at the end of the meeting today too, but just to remind you of kind of where we are in the process. So we have this working draft out. It's available on DSL's website. As we mentioned, we're soliciting feedback from you all tonight and in writing if you want to take a look at that working draft. DSL and OSU are gathering input through June 21st. We're going to continue to coordinate and work on revisions of the HCP with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. We'll take your information from the public and continued input from those agencies and revise the working draft HCP into an administrative draft HCP somewhere down the line. And then it's important to note that eventually, once the federal agencies feel like the HCP is in a suitable place, it will need to be analyzed under the National Environmental Policy Act. The issuance of the federal permits by the two federal agencies is a federal action. And so they have to analyze the HCP, they have to analyze the issuance of their permits as a federal action under NEPA. That process will start sometime later this year. It hasn't been defined as to when that process will start, but it'll start later this year. It'll run through the end of next year. And as the NEPA process unfolds, there will be at least 2 additional periods of time when there will be public engagement. The first of which will be the public scoping period at the beginning of the process. And then the public review period when the public draft NEPA document and the public draft habitat conservation plan will be released for a 45-day public review. The specific timing of the public scoping period and the public review period have not been set. That'll be communicated out by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who is leading the NEPA process, and DSL when the time comes. But I just wanted to highlight, since we're in kind of a public forum, that there will be some future public engagement in the NEPA process, and just to keep your eyes out for that. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ali, and we can move on to the next part of the agenda.
Thanks, Troy. The next part of the agenda is going to be questions, but first I'm going to ask the DSL and OSU project team folks to introduce themselves. So we will start doing that, but if you know you have a question or a thought you want to share, please go ahead and start raising your hands, which is again under reactions down at the bottom of your screen. So Bill Ryan, will you kick us off with introductions?
Sure, thanks, Ali, and thank you everybody for participating. My name is Bill Ryan. I am the Deputy Director of Operations at the Oregon Department of State Lands.
Thanks, Bill. Ryan Singleton, will you introduce yourself?
Sure, good evening. My name is Ryan Singleton. I'm the Department of State Lands Forester.
Thank you, Ryan. Randy, you are right next to Ryan, so I'm gonna go to you.
Okay, thank you. Hey everyone, I'm Randy Rosenberger. I'm Associate Dean in the College of Forest at Oregon State University and co-leading the OSU side of the process.
Thanks, Randy. And last but not least is Gordy.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gordy Reeves. I'm working for OSU as the aquatic, participating in the aquatic portion of the Elliott.
Thank you, Gordy. Okay, on to questions. We've got a couple folks with their hands raised. I'm going to call on people in the order that their hands were raised. Please introduce yourself, say who you are, where you're from, any organization you're representing. If you are, we do want to make sure we get to as many folks as possible. So if you can keep your question, at least initially, to a question and a quick follow-up. And then if you got more questions, raise your hand. Okay.
Ali, real quick.
Raise hands.
Oh, George. Hey, George, it's at the very bottom of your screen, there's a smiley face that says reactions.
Yeah.
If you click on that, there's a thing that says raise hands.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ellie, I was just going to reiterate what you said earlier. I took down the presentation so we could all see each other, but if there's a particular slide or something you want to revisit, just let me know and I'll put it back up. So.
Great. Okay, first up is Pegy Lynch. Pegy, will you unmute and ask your question?
I did, and thank you. Thanks for this again, yet still. So I'm Pegy Lynch. I am a volunteer with the League of Women Voters of Oregon. I have been following this process for a very long time. I have lots of questions, but I will start with just one. So if the OSU research forest doesn't happen, what happens to the HCP? Since what I heard was that the HCP is being developed with the concept that this would be a research forest. But if it doesn't turn out to be a research forest, what happens? And I understood that the decision to do whether or not to have a research forest was at the end of this year, December of 2021. Am I wrong with those dates? And I'll be quiet.
So, Allie, I think I'll weigh in to answer that. And so Pegy, the ultimate decision for the transfer of the forest actually is scheduled to happen in the December 2022 Land Board. But the Land Board has repeatedly given direction to the department to continue to work with OSU to work toward the creation of the Elliott State Research Forest and the eventual transfer of the lands. To answer your question about if that transfer doesn't happen, we actually are developing the HCP with the intent that if for whatever reason that transfer doesn't happen, that the department would continue to manage the forest under that HCP. And so the sort of that framework of the conservation and reserve and management areas that are outlined in the HCP would still be in place. And we would make the forest available for research to entities that might be interested in doing so, but we would also be operating and managing the forest based upon the HCP.
Okay, I see from Peggy's reaction, she may have a follow-up later. Next up with a question is Darlene. Darlene, will you go ahead and unmute and introduce yourself? And then after Darlene, we'll go to Anne Marie.
I'm Darlene Sherman. I represent the Great Old Broads for Wilderness with the chapter in Portland, Oregon. And my first question, I'd like some clarifications about the estimated average annual harvest. You know, it says it's about 1,000 acres per year, and this is table 3-3, I think. So since the thinning in the reserve areas would be within the first 20 years for the plan, I'm not sure what these numbers, how they pan out in terms of if this is on average over that 80 years. I don't quite get it, so maybe we get an explanation.
Yeah, thanks, Darlene. I'll start there, and if Ryan or anybody else has anything to add, they certainly can. Those numbers and the first couple of words really are important. The estimated average annual, because it is an average. It'll fluctuate. It won't be the same every year. Those numbers that are presented in that table really do represent that first 20 years because we've included the management thinning in the conservation reserve watershed. So then you can imagine that after that, as you move into the future from years 20 through 80, there would be intensive management and extensive management in line with the averages that are shown in that table. So we probably need to differentiate that in the table a little bit better so that it really shows what the average annual is. The other thing that I'll just, this is where my expertise in forestry will hit a limit right here in a minute, but I'll just say that, whenever we think about translating harvest into acres, there's volume versus acres, and we try to think about more in terms of acres in the HCP because that's really what, it's a better way to quantify it with respect to our covered species. So on the one hand, a lot of people like to think about it in terms of volume, which makes a lot of sense in a forestry perspective. So sometimes that translation into acres is, that's why we have to say things like estimated average annual, because we know that depending on the volume, that may fluctuate year to year. So that's kind of why it's phrased that way, I guess.
Sort of a follow-up with that, that if you have this a significant portion in the first 20 years that is thinning in the reserves, it seems like you're going to, if you have a 60-year rotation for all the extensive and intensive, that you're going to run out because you're not going to be able to do a second cut on areas because you're not going to cut very much in the beginning and they're not going to be 60 years old anymore. Somehow
Yeah, for this, the HCP, it was considered to be with 60-year rotations or any other harvest in perpetuity, so it would be sustainable. So there wouldn't be anything in there that would constitute running out of cut or volume. So I don't know if I understand your question completely. Maybe you could follow up and we could have a little more discussion.
Okay, well, I can do this at another time, but it seems that in order to have this volume, once you've done your one-time cut in the reserves, that you're going to have to do second cuts on some areas because of the areas that you have that are intensively and extensively managed.
Okay, so I think I understand a little bit better. Some of the intensive acres that are cut in that initial period, say the first 10 to 15 years, years really, they could see a second rotation with the term of the permit. So those could, actually be harvested again, considering a 60-year rotation. But yeah, most of that first 20 years in terms of acreage would be thinnings, like we've talked about in the conservation research watershed, there's reserve areas, but there's also cutting in intensive and extensive areas as well.
Okay, thank you.
Elliott, it looks like Peggy had put in a follow-up in the comments, and then also Doug Heiken had a comment, I guess. I don't know if it's a question so much, but Troy, I think this question for Peggy. Peggy said, to clarify, if HCP has a link to an assumption that there will be a research forest, wouldn't there need to be an amendment to the HCP if it wasn't a research forest? So that's if OSU does not take over the forest as a research forest.
Yeah, so and I think that follows on with your answer a little bit ago, Bill, the idea being that if OSU, wasn't involved, the DSL will still manage it as a research forest as described in the HCP. Now, if something altogether different, Peggy, were to happen and it was not managed as a research forest, say, the HCP would need to be reworked, to basically describe the activities that would be contemplated on the forest at that time. So there would be a point in time where if something altogether different was proposed, yes, a different HCP would need to be written. But as Bill mentioned earlier, I think the intention at this point is for it to be a research forest.
I'm going to leap in really quickly. So, but DSL can't afford to have it be a research forest under the Common School Fund unless they figure out how to de-link or decouple from the Common School Fund. So thank you for your answer. I appreciate it. I got the answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. Just to let you all know, I'm having a bit of internet instability. I'm hopeful that it's done now. But if I seem a little staticky, that's what's going on over here. Next up is Anne-Marie Oliver. And then after that, we're going to go to George. And then after that, we're going to go to Barry Sanders. And then Doug, I see that there's a question from you in the chat, as Bill pointed out. And so we're going to go to that after Barry. That's our lineup. Anne-Marie, please unmute and take it away.
Okay. 1 minute. Sorry for that artifacticity. Anne-Marie Oliver, Oregon Institute for Creative Research. Good afternoon. I just want to throw out some questions again, because sometimes when people deal with particular domains, they forget the outside world. They forget what's going on. They forget that the Arctic is right now on fire. They forget the beaches of Sri Lanka are covered with billions of nurdles and nitric acid. They forget that the quote unquote treated radioactive waters of Fukushima, the first 1 million tons, have been released into the Pacific Ocean. Nothing I heard tonight has any bearing anything whatsoever. I don't know what you mean by research or management research under the conditions in which we're living now, with 20 years left to turn the ship around. I don't hear anything at all that suggests that you have any interest in that world at all. It's very disturbing sitting here. You have no idea. And again, I know what it feels like to live in a domain where there's no necessary connection to the outside world, but I have to tell you how disturbing it is. At the end of the Trump administration, as you probably know, 3.5 million acres of the northern spotted owl, which was listed as a threatened species, as you know, in the Endangered Species Act of 1990, that is to say 21 years ago, was basically repealed. I want to know what bearing this Trump administration last minute administrative regulation has on what you said tonight. I want to know what you mean by a large number of terms that can only strike one outside of your department as obfuscatory. What do you mean by riparian thinning? What do you mean by recruited wood? What do you mean by intersection? What do you mean by, quote, targeted riparian enhancement and in-stream habitat creation, the diversification of plantations? That's clear. But what do you mean by in order that they would be able to perform better, since they perform perfectly well on their own? What do you mean by wood inflation? This is a quotation, wood inflation in the stream management research, retaining the habitat value, et cetera, et cetera. We're actually talking about living creatures. In the real meaning of the word creature, I don't feel any sense of that at all, that you are talking about creatures, sentient, feeling creatures. I assume that you're going to use these non-fish bearing because you can't see fish in the streams. So you think that you could destroy them, use them as waterways to remove wood. Please leave the Elliott as a real forest. We don't even know what a forest is. We don't even know what a forest is. Your research strikes people outside of your domain as something like we're going to do this damage, and then we're going to document what happens. We're going to document the aftermath of the Elliott State Forest. We don't even know whether Doug firs can survive in the road any longer, and you're cutting down even old growth forest. Please listen to people outside of what you do. Please, we beg of you. Most people have no idea what you're doing, and they would not agree with it. We've said this so many times, and every time I listen to one of these meetings, I can hardly describe the feeling that you are proceeding despite what is happening in the world. You cannot see what is happening. Please stop. Please stop. We beg of you, stop. It doesn't matter how many people in conservation groups say that they support you and go out and get a drink. Please stop. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
We have 20 years.
Okay. Thank you, Anne-Marie. I am going to ask the next person to unmute their microphone and ask their question or provide their thoughts. George, that is you.
Already unmuted, I hope. I have several questions. I apologize for missing the first 5 or so minutes of this meeting. Troy, what does ICF stand for? Number one. Number two, who is applying for this HCP? And then I heard some talk about if the OSU Research Forest Plan, which I don't think has been finalized, although it's very difficult to find out what's going on with that plan, OSU folks. Your system for feedback and responding to people with questions and concerns has been on a scale of A to F, about a Z. So anyway, Troy, what does ICF stand for? Who is applying for this HCP? And then I have one more question.
Yeah, thank you, George. So ICF is one of those, just acronyms that consulting companies now have. It originally actually stood for Intercity Fund. When the company was founded back in the 60s, and the focus of the company was to work on affordable housing in inner cities around the country. Since then, ICF has expanded to do a lot of other things, including environmental work like I do, but it stands for Intercity Fund, but we've shortened it to ICF some number of years ago. And who is applying for the permit? That's actually an excellent question. So Department of State Lands will be applying for the permit from the federal agencies. DSF. And then when the forest is ultimately transferred to OSU, that permit would go along with that transfer. So there would be a transfer of the permit from Department of State Lands to OSU at that point in time.
Okay, great. Now, Troy, during your presentation, you were talking about research management activities. One of those activities projected was the construction of new roads. And the only new roading or anywhere in any forest that I'm aware of that's happened pretty much during my tenure in Oregon, which began in 1987, has been to enable logging trucks to extract logs. So these new roads will basically be for logging. Is that correct?
By and large, that's correct. Yeah, Ryan may weigh in if there are other instances there. I think there may also be some instances of existing roads being moved or relocated. So there could be a new road built to replace, in a better location to replace an existing road. But by and large, yeah, roads, and mostly probably temporary spur roads, just like you would expect
right,
to facilitate logging.
And my understanding, the HCP is basically, did I say that right? HCP. Yep. Yeah, HCP is basically to try and protect what is left of the Oregon Coast coho, the marbled murrelet, and the spotted owl. I'm concerned that the Oregon State University Research Forest Plan has not integrated even the full depth and breadth of their own larger department to have soil folks in there and wildlife conservation and wildlife biology people's input. It certainly hasn't done a good job of integrating the input coming from the local community. Even the list of invitees on this, gosh, there ought to be not 15 of us participating right now. There ought to be 150 of us. It was a very limited invitation list for this. One of the more expert people on the OSU's forest practices and the OSU plan is a fellow named Doug Pollock. He's not even on this call and wasn't invited on it. It's unfortunate because you're missing an awful lot of feedback of caring human beings. And I'm the last speaker, more of a poet, I suspect, than a forest research activist. But I think that's where a very large, hundreds of thousands of Oregonians are starting to come down on, that we want to see our planet and our forests survive, and that logging to pay for research doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Just to clarify, this is a open public meeting. The invite went to the Elliott email list, which includes, I think, 300 or 400 people. Certainly Mr. Pollock is among them. The information about these sessions is also posted on our Elliott State Forest website, which if you all haven't been there, definitely check it out. So I see Gianna noting that she also had a hard time finding the link for this meeting. So your two resources are going to be that email update list and that DSL Elliott website. This meeting was front and center there. So thank you though for your feedback. We will see what we can do to get more folks to sign up and get more folks to be aware of where this information lives. Okay, next up is Barry Sanders.
Thank you.
Barry, you got some reverb.
Yeah, I've got it. It'll be gone in a second. George, thank you.
Can you hear that?
Very much for your comments. I want to second them, and maybe as we're moving into a slight post-pandemic phase, we might also have social distancing live meeting. And I too feel like this is a monumental thing that's happening. And I've been to many, many city council meetings, maybe not many, but enough to know that public input sometimes is a way of ensuring that the public is not heard. We can say we've heard from the public and now we're going forward and incorporating. It'd be nice to know how all this is going to be incorporated. When my colleague made this impassioned plea, George calls poetic, which I appreciate, but not totally accurate. I think it deserves some discussion and more than a thank you. But I want to ask you, Troy Regman, a question and then make a comment if I may. And the question is a very pointed one about that northern spotted owl and those millions of acres that at the last minute by President Trump that are now before, I think, Deb Haaland and the Biden administration, and under litigation, by the way, by several conservation groups. I want to know what the what OSU stance is about this and how they've dealt with this and what stance they've taken and what position they've taken.
Yeah, maybe I can start off and just talk about how we've handled that in the context of the HCP. And I think that'll probably also—
I'm not just asking about the HCP, just to interrupt you, I'm very sorry, but I'm asking about the stance about this group that is now going to be taking over that forest. It's proposed. Though I think in your language, you never use the word proposal. And I was very struck by that. You use the word will, and that this has happened. And I was very much struck by that and stayed in my mind. But nonetheless, I'm not asking for it's being folded into this HCP. I'm asking about the stance and what you're arguing about, since you use the phrase species-centric. Species-centric. That means the northern spotted owl. That means creatures alive. What is your stance and what has been the stance? What will it be? And have you entered into any of these discussions with Deb Haaland, the Trump Biden administration, any of the litigation, anything whatsoever? I'd like to hear something.
So to summarize for the group, what Barry's talking about is at the end of the Trump administration, they proposed to vacate several million acres of northern spotted owl critical habitat that had been previously designated, 3.5 million. And then when the administrations changed, the Biden administration is now taking another look at that and is being challenged by and sued by several entities to take another look at that and determine whether or not the vacation of that 3.5 million acres was just. So I'm not going to say anything about my stance on it. Personally, it doesn't really matter what I'm saying, but I will tell you, hold on, Barry, let me just describe for 1 second what we've decided to do in the HCP. I appreciate that, but just note that what you see in the draft HCP, we decided to leave the original designation of critical habitat, understanding that the current proposal or what was done by the Trump administration is being challenged, and I suspect will likely be overturned and revert back to some version of what was done or what was in place before. So we didn't adopt in the HCP draft that you see and this isn't correct. I'll just say the Trump version of critical habitat. We stuck with the originally designated critical habitat from before. So that's just wanted to state that so everybody's clear what you see in the HCP. And we do describe potential effects on critical habitat, and there's a map in there that shows how it overlays with the Elliott, and that represents the previous designation. So
notice how much better, at least some of us might feel, about the argument by OSU that this is species centric and we do care about these creatures and these animals. If in fact you would have taken a stance, the group would have taken a stance, the group would have made a comment. It would be very, very powerful and very important. But nonetheless, let me go on to my comment because I don't want to control the whole thing. But I think in a HCP plan about one of the oldest old growth forests in the country, I didn't hear once the word tree mentioned. What I heard was the word wood. It has become, and I think there's obfuscation, and I thank you, George, for pointing out that these roads are going to be logging roads for wood. This is fantastic. This is fantastical. As Anne Marie says, we have very little time. I hope people have read the UN-backed report about how much time we actually had. This is dire. And so there is this wood question. And then I want to ask you about transporting timber, trees, down rivers, and what effect that has in terms of the waterways and pollution of the fish in general. Have you thought about it? Because these rivers are they're not separated. They're all connected with each other. This is a system.
Yeah, and I don't, sorry, go ahead, Barry. Oh, I was, in terms of transporting wood down rivers, that I think I may, if I misspoke, I didn't mean to, and wasn't my intention. What I was talking about was, the recruitment of wood into the stream to create habitat for Oregon Coast coho. So not transporting timber downstreams, that'll be done obviously by truck. So sorry if I misspoke on that.
Recruitment of wood. I wish we could speak, I wish we'd had English in all of these and a kind of language that spoke to the vital quality of the forest and the creatures in it, rather than the language of management. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. We are going to go now to the chat, where Doug asked about half an hour ago a question that we're just now getting to. He asked, Doug, I can read it. If you want to unmute and jump in, you are welcome to. He says, I hope there's research to validate whether logging riparian forest actually enhances wood input, because there are many reasons to think it doesn't. Logging subtracts biomass. How can it add wood?
Yeah, maybe I'll start on that and Gordy can jump in. So one of in the OSU proposal, there's a long list of potential research topics and activities, and one of them certainly is that very thing that you're describing. And Gordy, I saw you unmuted. Do you want to spend a minute just talking about some of the ideas about researching that very topic?
Yeah, well, first, I think we should be very clear when we talk about any harvest of wood in the riparian areas. It only happened in previously managed stands. If there are natural stands, they're not being touched. In many cases where management has happened in the past, we have dense overstock stands of conifer and also an absence of hardwoods. And that's compromised both the wood recruitment and the energetics of the system. So we're focused on restoring those ecological processes. So any active management will only occur in previously managed stands. Okay, so I think we need to be, when we talk about harvest, we need to keep that in mind. And we don't know, because we don't have a good inventory about how much of the riparian area on the Elliott that will involve. Because we like, as I said, we just don't have a good handle. So, and secondly, as part of that management, all the wood is not going to be taken away. There's been work done within response to a joint effort between National Marine Fisheries Service and the Forest Service, where we showed that you could do thinning and add a proportion of the wood to the channel during that, of the trees that are harvested. And you could have more wood in the channel immediately and over the long term than if you left to stand alone. So we're trying to restore these systems because we know they've been damaged, and we're using the best available science to do that.
Thanks, Gordy. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the folks who have their hands raised. If you've got your hand up and you didn't mean for it to be up, now is a good time for you to take it down. But we're gonna have Anne-Marie and then Darlene, and then there's some more questions coming into the chat, so I'm gonna go back to the chat after that. But Anne-Marie, you are up. And you're muted.
Okay, we're having to, can you hear me now, Allie? Yeah, okay. I do have more questions. Are you going to spray pesticides in the forest?
So I'll jump in on that one. So in the covered activities chapter, one of the conversations that is actually ongoing as part of this working draft is what that will look like as part of management. So you'll see a short description there about herbicide application as part of a management activity, but it's an ongoing conversation about whether or not it would be covered under the HCP.
What? Okay, but again, the language, we deserve better, and the forest deserves better. Like, just, I mean, what you just said to me is that, I actually don't know what you just said. That it will be quote unquote covered. What will be covered? Using poisons in a living forest will be covered? What does that mean? Is that a legal term? Will be covered by the
That's right, it's a legal term. That's right. They'll be covered by the permits under the Endangered Species.
I think what people would like to hear instead of this, and no offense, seriously, with all due respect, I think what people long to hear is they want to hear about the trees and the animals that live in the forest, why you feel the need to document the extent of logging to see how much you can get out under these conditions and that conditions. When what most people want to do, since this is, or want to see happen is given the fact that this is Oregon's first public forest, first state forest. And it's actually been given to a forestry school that is frankly inseparable from big timber. I'm really sorry. That's just the truth. It cannot be taken seriously when you talk about conservation under these conditions. I'm really sorry. So I still haven't understood, and I don't think anyone else has understood, when we're talking about using poisons in a living entity that we call a forest, and again, we have no idea what it is, and what kind of damages it could sustain. I haven't heard a thing about the fact that the northern spotted owl, as you know, and there's masses of research done on the northern spotted owl. It's not like you will be discovering anything. We already know so much. We know that these animals love to nest in ancient trees. Ancient trees. They don't like little tiny young trees. They like ancient trees, and that's where they nest. They don't even build nests, as you know. That's why the limbs of the tree have to be large. So what we want to know is, are you going to poison this forest? And so saying that this may be covered, I'm not really sure what you said, honestly. may be covered under the HCP, I mean, I guess the question is either at this point in time, the answer is yes, we're going to use poisons in the forest with all that that entails. It means damage and destruction. And it's only for one reason, to log. It's only for one reason, because people can't be bothered actually to bend down and pull up a weed. It's pretty much like that. They're too lazy to bend down and pull up a weed. They have to spray poisons everywhere and contaminate everything. The extent of this poisoning is unclear. It should be that this should be agreed upon, and it should not happen at all. But I still haven't understood the answer to my question. It's a very simple question. Are you going to put poisons? You're going to spray them over streams, over animals, over nests, over trees. And so I still don't understand the answer to my question.
Well, I'm happy to answer it again. And I'm going to say the same thing, which is that they are proposed as a covered activity under the HCP. The extent to which is yet to be determined. You'll see a very short summary of it in the working draft, and we are continuing to work with the federal agencies on exactly what would be allowed under the federal permits and what would not be allowed. So that's the answer to the question.
Mr. Romick, if I could respond quickly. This is the answer called, this is a whole philosophy of life. It's called proceduralism. You could destroy the world if you wanted to and follow the correct procedures. It's called, it is called proceduralism, because the person believes that by following procedures that everything's okay, but everything is not okay. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Okay, Darlene, you are up.
Hi, I would like to ask some questions about the stream buffers. There are the table 3-2 that describes the different buffers depending whether it's fish bearing and non-fish bearing perennial streams. But what I would like to have a better sense about is, I guess, what's covered under here under this XNFB, which are seasonal non-fish bearing streams, which is the bulk of the streams in the forest, according to this. So what kind of management would be for those streams if they are in intensive or extensive management areas?
Gordon, do you want to lead off on that one, or would you like me to?
Let me just explain real quickly. What we've identified on the Elliott is 3 times more streams than what had previously been described. We use LiDAR based map to delineate the stream network, and because of that steep, highly dissected nature of the Elliott, there's roughly 2,000 miles of streams we've identified, where previously there were 700. The bulk of these are in these non-fish bearing streams. These are streams that either because of their gradients or because of a barrier do not have fish in them. Now, saying they're non-fish bearing streams does not mean they're not important ecologically. We know that these streams are important. Since the Northwest, prior to the Northwest Forest Plan back in 1994, these streams got no attention at all. Now they're really the centerpiece of discussions about management and what's going to happen. How do we manage them? Mm-hmm. What you'll see is in the conservation research watersheds, mm-hmm. and in much of the extensive, those are pretty much fully covered, even though we don't show a buffer in there. And we don't show them having buffers in the CRW or the extensive. The reason for why we didn't show a buffer is because of the thinning. We have a different thinning strategy for what happens in the riparian areas versus the outside areas. If we had put essentially a 200-foot buffer around those streams, there would be no management of the terrestrial systems, and it would really take up. Essentially, you would lock up the whole forest.
Okay.
If you did that. Okay. So even though it says they don't have a buffer, they do have a buffer because
so what about the intensive management areas?
The intensive areas, again, keep in mind what the purpose was. That's the for us to look at as closely as we could how intensively managed landscapes are operated. We have a proportion of those, a small proportion, I will grant, of those headwater streams will have buffers on them, and no harvest buffers except for previously managed stands. And so what we will be doing is then we got the ability now to compare and contrast what happens in a landscape where you do have active management in those systems versus where you don't. And we've got the conservation research watershed to compare. So we're using that to, again, learn. And as we learn more about what happens as a result of management, we can begin to make better decisions and policies about how to manage it.
So what is currently...
Keep in mind, Peggy, 87% of the stream network is covered in reserves of some sort. So that, we're talking about 13% of it.
I guess, I mean, what is the current status if this were in a forest that's underneath the forest, the state forest management plan? What would the buffers be for those non-fish bearing seasonal streams?
Troy, I don't know the specific. I know on private lands, they would get no protection. On the state land, I don't know. I don't know what the particular interests are. So I just want to say what we've done is identified what we call the ones that have the highest probability of delivering wood from the fish-bearing stream down into the non-fish-bearing streams into the.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand in terms of the value for the coho of the in-stream wood, but I am concerned because there are other values of those buffers of sedimentation, and if there are pesticides that are used and the things that can get into the streams and the temperature, if there's no shading, because that warm water goes downstream where there are fish.
Right. And again, we've got the buffers we have, on the fish-bearing stream. And I should say the fish-bearing stream are roughly about 70%. I think there are 70 miles more we've identified 70 miles more fish-bearing streams on the Elliott than was identified by ODF. So we've got, and we've got the much bigger buffers than ODF would apply to those. So those are being protected. And then you got the perennial non-fish-bearing streams. Again, there's more of those, and they're getting bigger buffers than would have been under the Forest Practices Act. And so, we're talking about 13% of the stream network. And I understand, the concerns about how these are being treated. I look at this as an opportunity to learn. We've got these reserves, and we can learn from how management affects these streams, hopefully relatively quickly, and begin to make adjustments in them in the way we manage them. But I would say this is, this is as good a riparian protection strategy as is available right now, is it being implemented anywhere.
Thank you.
And really quick, Ali, if I could just add on to that, and Gordy touched on this, but I mentioned in the slide, I mentioned recruitment of wood and so forth. But in the HCP, we do have a extensive discussion about temperature and sedimentation and other things. So you're right. There are multiple things at play there, and we do summarize that information in the HCP. So.
Thanks, Troy. Okay, so in the interest of trying to merge the questions that we're getting in the chat and the questions that we're getting from folks raising their hands, if you've got a question in the chat right now that hasn't been answered, please put your hand up. I'm going to come to you before I go to the folks who have their hands raised, because I think everybody at this point has had a chance to ask a question. If you, Sue Craig, I see you with your hand up. So, and we haven't heard from you yet, so I'm going to go to you.
Okay, I'm just concerned about the beaver population, and if you're making any plans, I know they're not supposed to be on your list of critters that are endangered, but they can add so much to our forests, and we're still letting them being trapped, etc., which is not your purview. But how are you going to work beavers into this? Or are they there already? Or I'm just curious.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Sorry. Thanks, Sue. It's a great point. And even though they're not on our list of species, we do have some discussion about beaver in the Habitat Conservation Plan and the role that they play, and all the things that you just said, and the benefits that they have, in particular for Oregon Coast coho in the lower part of the watersheds. And so that is intended to be part of the overall strategy for Oregon Coast coho, is allowing beavers to do what they do best, and that is thrive and build habitat. So yeah, you'll see a discussion of that in the HCP.
Okay, how are you going to keep them from being trapped?
Well, I think in terms of trapping that would be allowed on the forest, I mean, I know there is some tension there between what ODF&W and others do, but I can't speak for OSU or for DSL on this, but I think based on what is written in the HCP, the intention is that they would be sort of used as sort of a management tool, a natural management tool, if you will, and allowed to thrive and not trapped. Now, I don't know if we don't have any provisions in the HCP that talks about trapping beavers. And so as far as we've written, that's not anticipated, but I don't know if anybody from either DSL or OSU wants to weigh in more specifically on that. Bill does.
I'll weigh in, Troy. Yeah, Sue, thanks for that question. And so, basically the law is that if you have property that has beaver on it and you want to get rid of them, no one can tell you not to do that. But if you as a property owner do not want to remove beaver, then nobody can come in and just do that. And so the expectation is that OSU, when managing the forest, would be managing the beaver for the restoration ecological processes that the beavers contribute to. And so the forest management plan isn't into the weeds or into that level of detail, but that is the case. So it's not like somebody would just come in and start killing beavers indiscriminately.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
OSU here.
Okay, so the remaining questions in the chat were from Gianna and Peggy. Do either of you want to ask? Bill has also noted in the chat that the things that are there that we don't answer, we'll follow up with afterward. But do either of you want to ask the questions that you currently have in the chat?
No, I'm fine. This has been a good learning experience. I really appreciated Darlene's questions around stream buffers, et cetera. That was very helpful. And I did laughingly say with the last question related to beavers, we are talking OSU here. I would assume there'll be some sort of protection there. But thanks for all this, for the information. I did learn some things this evening, and I don't have anything else. I'll just listen.
Great. Okay, and I'm seeing Gianna still on mute, so we will just get to your question afterwards. Okay, so the next person, Gianna says her questions are not urgent. Well, thank you. If you want to ask them, you can, but we will follow up with you. And then folks who have their hands up, and we have Anne-Marie and then George, and then Barry, I see you wanting to speak after George. Okay, Anne-Marie. Oh, Anne-Marie, you're still muted.
Can Barry go? Yeah. Can you?
Yeah, but you have to close off your sound. Oh, I see. Okay, can you hear me? So,
yeah.
Allie, this is a question for you.
Okay.
Oddly enough, maybe. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
Oh.
I can hear you, Allie.
I can hear both of you.
No, that's weird.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yep.
Okay, so this is a question for you, and it sort of takes off from a comment that George made. What I count is 7 people from the public here tonight, plus one of our students was on the telephone from the San Joaquin Valley with poor reception, so we didn't see his face. What I count is 5 people from OSU. So we have, you know, in a kind of strange way, we do have a public presence here in a little tiny Zoom pandemic COVID-19 meeting. I want to know from you a couple of things. One, I know it may be on the website, but I'd like to know a calendar about what the steps are for the next couple of months and what it would mean for there to be a public meeting in which we could have some discussion, and what indeed happens to this public discussion. How does it get folded into any kind of discussion? I've been with this for some time now, not a long time, but some time, for a couple of years, and have seen myself, none of the public comments folded into any kind of reasonable kind of statements about what's going on. And so what is going on, and what is the calendar, and what are the next steps, and is there a final date?
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen. I can figure out how to do it. Okay, please stand by. We are having a live demo here.
Finally.
Who doesn't love a live chance for me to have my internet not work very well? Okay. Zoom. Okay, so let's see if this is going to let me do it. All right. To share my screen. Oh man, technology. You are great, but okay, here we go. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so this is our Elliott State Forest website. And one of the things that's on this website, so let me first say, there's a ton of information on this website, and we are always interested in hearing from folks about how to better arrange it, how to better organize it, so you guys can find what you're looking for, because a key part of people being able to know what's going on and to participate in what's happening is being able to find information. So we balance, right? Because we want you guys to know what's happening now, but we also want you to have access to all the information about what's happened in the past, and boy, does it get to be a lot. So one of the things that we tried to put front and center was this Elliott State Research Forest 2021-22 project timeline. If you click that open, which I think I'm sharing my entire screen and not just this window. So if I do this, do you guys now see that timeline?
It's really
yes.
tiny.
It's really tiny. Let's zoom in. Okay, this is the entire, oh, for Pete's sake. This is the entire two-year timeline for 2021 and 2022 about what's happening with all these different work streams. So we've got advisory committee, OSU proposal, forest management plan, all the financial aspects, decoupling, carbon, startup costs, all the various outreach and engagement of both the public and tribes, HCP development, and then related forest management plans. So these are all the pieces of work that need to happen for us to get to December 2022 to see, to have there be a final decision on an OSU research forest before the land board, which is not to say that all of this is going to be done by then, but that's where these key pieces are going to converge in their final decision. So this is on the website. This gives you a great, just at a glance view of what's coming up. But back to the website. So the what's happening now section is where we really highlight the things that are happening now. So as you can see now, we're talking about the working draft of the Elliott HCP, which we are taking feedback on because, Barry, this gets to the other part of your question. It's going to help OSU and DSL make further refinements to the HCP ahead of submission to the federal agencies for their consideration as part of that formal National Environmental Policy Act process, which also includes, as Troy said, additional feedback and comment opportunities. So here we've got the Elliott information session information last week and this week, and then this button right here, that's the Elliott update sign up list. And then underneath that, we've got an advisory committee who's giving us input and insight on many things related to finalizing the research forest details as work continues. We've got information about their upcoming advisory committee meetings and upcoming work group meetings, which are informal groups that need to discuss various topics. So you can see here, we're looking at advisory committee meetings, July, September, November. There's not any work group meetings currently scheduled.
Are any of these meetings open?
Oh yeah, they're all open. I mean, there's no live links because there's nothing like the meetings are information's posted the week before the meeting, but they're all open to the public. Public can attend. We post notes after the meeting, and we're also going to be posting meeting videos to YouTube. So if the meeting's not at a convenient time for you, you want to catch up afterward, you're going to have the option of either reading the meeting notes or, if you've got 3 or 4 hours of watching the meeting in its entirety. Barry, back to your question. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody again. Okay, so back to your question. I think what you were really asking is, I think you were asking about some of what I just said, but I think you're also asking, when is there going to be an opportunity for people to come together and talk about these things, these streams of work that are continuing? And the answer to that is we don't have anything planned right now, but we're open to it. Like, we are open to hearing about, like, what kind of format do you want? What kind of a setting do you want? What kind of topics are you interested in? Open to ideas. And I have, now that I shared my screen, I've lost track of who was first in line. So we just heard from you guys. I know you want to talk. Do you have a follow-up to what I just said? I see you waving at me, Anne-Marie. And I can't hear you.
Okay. Can you turn? Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. Two things. One is a desire or wish, and the other is a real question. It's a question. The first is what I think we would like to see, and I'm sure many of the colleges and universities in Portland and throughout Oregon, we'd be interested in this as well, because this is what we do when something with this many possible consequences and ramifications are entailed. We would like to have a roundtable discussion with people actually answering right there on the spot other people's concerns, maybe with a set of readings. You guys could come up with a set of readings and we could come up with a set of readings about forest and what they are. What should happen with forests now? What is a forest, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we would really like, where actually it's not about further refinement of a plan with which I would hazard the guess that the vast majority of Oregonians would actively, nay, proactively oppose if they knew it were happening. They want the Elliott to remain a forest. There is no need for further research. There's masses of research, nor is there need for further so-called management. Leave it alone. It's sacred. It should be untouchable. That's our basic philosophy. So we would actually have like a discussion about things that actually matter, not procedures, not at what point we're going to turn over this and submit this report and so forth and so on, but rather a much larger question. There are actually people at OSU who sat on the panel of the United Nations and came up with a plan with regards to what is happening in our world and on our earth. And it's an absolute catastrophe if anyone is interested. And we have yet to meet a single person who has actually read the advanced version of the UN report, not at OSU and not anywhere else. So that would be a text that it looks like, given that how it was produced and why it was produced, we could actually come together around a round table and actually have a very frank, direct discussion based on this United Nations study. That's what people want to see. They don't want their comments simply used to advance a plan which they think is wrong-headed and will result in immense damage, particularly given the fact that the Elliott State Forest is our land and it is surrounded by clear cut. We have almost nothing left. We have almost nothing left. But I have a question after that. That's what we would want to see.
Okay.
Not the co-optation of our comments and remarks, but rather a frank discussion about the world and the earth we want to leave our children. That's what we want to have, is that kind of discussion. I have a question. Who is paying for all of this development? Because that's really the word. The development of the Elliott State Forest, new facilities, new roads, and so forth and so on. Who is paying for this?
Bill Ryan.
Yeah, Allie, I'll weigh in on that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that is a really good question. And so right now,
I can't hear. Nobody can hear.
I can hear you, Bill. There we go.
Yeah, I don't think I was muted. Can you hear me, Allie?
Yep, I can hear you. Anne-Marie, can you hear Bill?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so currently the Department of State Lands, which is funded by the Common School Fund, is paying for the startup cost basically for preparing for the transfer. And so we're paying for the work that goes into developing the HCP and some data collection and planning that OSU is doing to take on the forest. Once the forest is actually transferred to OSU, then OSU would be responsible for paying for the ongoing operations and management of the research forest. And there is still the outlying piece of decoupling the forest from the Common School Fund, and that is that is at this point about $120 million question. And at this point, various folks in state and federal government are looking at ways to fund that and to decouple the forest so that it no longer has the responsibility. We don't have the legal responsibility to generate revenue for the Common School Fund from the forest. And that is a big outstanding question. And when we talked about what if this transfer doesn't happen, that's one of the biggest things that is still hanging out there that needs to be resolved for the transfer to occur.
So can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're echoing pretty badly, but I can hear you.
Just turn that on. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I am not sure I understand that. I just want to clarify. So basically, I've never understood the Common School Fund angle. It's never made any sense to me at all because it doesn't seem that will work, but maybe I'm wrong. So am I right in saying that taxpayers actually are going to be funding the beginning stages of this venture? And two, where is OSU going to find? Is it 120 million? If I said right now, I have 150 million, and I want to buy the Elliott State Forest, and I want it to remain a forest, can I do that?
Well, you couldn't just walk in the door and write a check. You would have to basically present that proposal to the State Land Board, because the State Land Board is the entity that actually manages the Elliott State Forest and the other common school fund properties that the state manages to generate revenue for schools. And so the State Land Board has made the decision and has directed the department to work with OSU to try to transfer the Elliott State Forest to OSU to be operated as a research forest. So that's the direction that we have been given, and that is what we are trying to implement here. And the HCP is a tool. It's basically a legal tool that allows the management and harvest on the forest and complying with the Endangered Species Act compliance for the 3 species that are covered. So that's what we're talking about here. So if someone came in the door with $150 million and said, hey, I want to save the Elliott, I think you would have some certain interest from the State Land Board members, and that's the governor and the treasurer and the Secretary of State. But so far that hasn't happened.
What is this? I'm sorry. What is the amount? What is the magic number?
Well, to decouple the forest, it's roughly $121 million. And that's based upon the appraised value of the forest that was from an appraisal from, I think it's roughly 5 years ago now. So we will need to actually update the appraisal, and we will be doing that in the next year. But that's a pretty good number to go with. You know, we don't anticipate it to be significantly different from that number.
Mr. Ryan, I'm so sorry, but I missed the number because we're having to toggle things here. What is the magic number?
121 million.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, Anne Marie. Thank you, Bill. George, Pegy, I see you. George is ahead of you. So I'm going to go to George and then we'll go to Pegy.
Thank you. The research management activities, which entail road building, logging, spraying, replanting, probably fertilizing, happen. And then the actual research part of it is observing what happens after those events. And those events, the real high point of those events, of course, is logging, cutting live trees, including thousands of acres. I believe thousands of acres of old growth trees are included in that cut. So that would be a question. Am I accurate saying thousands of acres of old growth trees? My real question, though, the bottom line is 100 acres, 500 acres, 2,000 acres of old growth trees. Regardless, after 100 years plus of logging, don't you researchers, don't you foresters, you PhDs in various forms of forestry, don't you really already have the answers to all these things?
Here, 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 here. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thanks, George. Pegy, would you go ahead and?
Well, I just want to do a little history and a little clarifying because I want to make sure that everybody at least understands the bigger picture. So the taxpayers of Oregon actually bought $100 million worth of conservation of the forest. Otherwise, its price was $220 million. And so if anybody were to come in with 120 million, that would also have to be discussed as far as what they would do and to make sure that that conservation easement continued, because that's really important. Those of us who've been working on the Elliott for a long time at least got part of the forest conserved, related to at least having the state taxpayers buy from the Common School Fund, and the Common School Fund is the owner. And so tonight we are not hearing from the school people who want to make sure that school kids get some benefit from the Elliott. And I just want to make sure that people understand that this is a broader discussion than whether or not we should save the Elliott. And the League, amongst other people, spent a lot of time making sure that this forest was not sold to private entities. So, you know, we've worked hard to try to do that. We are now hoping to see whether, well, we want to see, and we have reservations about whether or not the OSU research forest is going to be successful or not. In the first place, we're not sure whether or not they can find that 120 million plus the monies to monitor the HCP, monies to move forward with the, I think it's 28 or $30 million worth of a structure for the research. So there's a lot of obligation that OSU is going to have to come up with. In the meantime, we're concerned about whether or not, what happens to this forest. And so whether it goes to OSU or stays with DSL, we want to make sure that, that the forest stays as public as possible. So I just want to make sure that people understood that you can't just come in. We, the taxpayers, have already bought part of this forest, at least the conservation easement from it. So thank you.
If we own it, then why is it being given to us?
Okay, I am seeing a couple hands left up. George and Anne-Marie, do you guys have your hands up on purpose or on accident? Okay. George is saying.
Do you see Sue Craig's?
I did not see Sue Craig. Oh, Sue, I'm sorry. You're in my bottom right hand corner.
Hand up.
She had your actual hand up. I know. I usually see when somebody's waving at me, but I missed you. Go right ahead, Sue.
Sorry. I'll use my little thing next time. I was just wondering what, and I know this is way off the cuff, but the lowest altitude of the Elliott, and is there quite a bit of land in the Elliott at that level? Does it go up fast? How much does it go up? just off your head, you know.
Yeah, or maybe I'll start and Ryan or somebody else can weigh in there. So, I mean, the elevations range from, you know, pretty close to sea level all the way up to just over, I think, 2,000 feet. Okay. And in general, it's, I don't know how the percentage that is at sort of the lower elevations, but it's a steep forest. So it goes up quickly. So that's about all I can say. I don't know if anybody else has more to say that would quantify it any better, but yeah, it's a steep forest, but it does range from around sea level to about 2,000 feet.
Yeah, Troy, you got it. It's really steep, Sue. Yeah, highest point is just, I think, around 2,100 feet and nearly down to sea level, but it is a very steep forest and some pretty rough terrain, so to speak.
Barry, I see you. Anne-Marie, did you have? I did see your hand. Anne-Marie, is your hand up on purpose or no. Okay? No.
So I wanted to thank you, Elliott, for you have to turn it for I wanted to thank you for your response to my question, and wanted to. I don't know why this is doing.
I don't either.
Wait.
I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Oh, from you, Barry.
Just use this.
So
use this. Wait a minute. Let's see.
I don't know what's happening.
Okay, can you hear?
Yes, yes, okay. I can.
Okay.
So,
sorry.
What you did hear my thank you.
I did hear your thank you.
Here's a question, and maybe a very specific one. I might make it specific this way. What if some people said, as Anne-Marie said, and I want to underscore, we don't want pesticides to be used in the forest. And how would that get, that notion, that argument, get folded into this discussion, and at what level? And the reason I ask that is that after a year and a half or so of doing this, this is very complicated, and I agree with you that it's very complicated and had lots of pieces, had a particular kind of structure and a particular sort of assignment of people and authorities. But now that we see what's happening, I want to suggest that we have a change in the kind of structure going forward. And there has to be, I think there must be public input that's taken very, very, very seriously as we know more about this. And I think there should be, I don't know how to do it. I'm thinking only of a public committee as with the same authority as an advisory committee, but from the public, because what do I need to do? Do I need to pass around a petition? And if I get a certain number of people saying, yes, we want no pesticides, then it goes into the OHC? Is that what happens? Or we just talk about it and then we go back to the original plan? So you have to understand that this can be very, very frustrating. It is very, very frustrating. And I know that people have good intentions, but I think there may be a way to have better outcomes and more efficient outcomes and outcomes that really do affect more citizens. And I want to know how we can do that. I don't know if you want to decide tonight, but I would like a response to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. And there was quite a bit of discussion related to pesticides during the discussion of the research forest proposal. And I am not the right person to provide that information, but we can get you some additional information about that.
No, but I don't want information. I want to be able to have a discussion now at this point on June 3rd, going forward. That's what I want to have. We're better informed. We know more stuff now. We feel maybe less overwhelmed by the discussion of this forest. And I'm saying I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about we're putting things in focus now, and we have to make adjustments for little changes in our trip. We needed more luggage. We needed to change our trip. We needed more gas. I'm not really asking for justification.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Okay, Peggy.
So let me follow up with that really quickly, and I just put this in the chat. The advisory committee that was mentioned and that for which you can get a link on the Elliott has a representation of a great many different varied interests, including conservation interests and others. And you can talk to each one of those people individually and reach out to them. And that's another way to have your voice heard. And I suspect that group has been talking about pesticides.
I want to respond to what you're saying, Ms. Lynch. We followed this for some time. And to be perfectly frank, I haven't really seen any rigorous conservation opposition to this plan. And I think that's just another way of actually avoiding what it is we're calling for. We're actually calling for a discussion, not for more proceduralism, not for more chain of command. Those persons were chosen, and we heard what they had to say at the State Land Board. And it doesn't represent any of the Oregonians whom I know, not a single one. Not a single one. So you know, you can pick and choose your people all you want, but it doesn't mean that they're representative. And I mean, I say that with all due respect to you. We actually want a discussion, nor is anything in the world now a matter of information. I agree with Mr. Hutchinson. We have all the information we need. We have all the research we need. We know quite a bit about what it even means to cut a road through a forest and what happens almost without exception, because the roads are there for one purpose. So we don't need further pretense. We don't need further delusion or illusion. We want reality, and we want to actually address what is going on in the world based in no small part on the United Nations Advanced Report on what is happening to our world. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. The last thing we need is one more forest turned over for research logging. How much damage can we inflict before the whole thing collapses? You know, Carl Jaspers many, many decades ago pointed out that the world, the earth is now our laboratory. And in fact, the people at OSU are calling this as something like a laboratory, living laboratory. No, laboratory is a place that's enclosed and hermetically sealed so that what happens there can't destroy everything, but only some things. We can't treat the world any longer as a giant laboratory for experimentation. That's what this is.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne Marie. Thank you very much.
Miss Craig is.
I see her. Sorry, I couldn't get myself out on mute. Sue, I'm going to go to you, and then we are going to wrap up after that. So go ahead, Sue.
Thank you for your time, you guys. You're really doing something. All right. I just wondered, I know that OSU has been asked to include other departments in this whole process. Is that being done now, or is that in the future? Or I think it was supposed to be a broader scope than just the Department of Forestry. Peggy saying yes.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, we have broadened the number of people and different departments that are associated with OSU and outside of OSU. We pulled in experts from across the country as well. And this has been a process that we've done all along. It just wasn't as visible as people would like to have seen. Okay. But I also want to just acknowledge that the people within the College of Forestry represent a diversity of disciplines. And so we did not have any disciplines that were not represented. What we're doing now is adding additional people from outside the college with similar disciplines to amplify some of the work that's there. Again, as well as engaging with people at U of O, PSU, Colorado State, and many other institutions.
Forestry schools. Sure.
Thank you.
Pete's sake. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Randy. We are at 7:30 on the dot, so I am going to bring us to a close. Thank you all so very much for joining us this evening. I'm going to put in one more plug for the Elliott website. The direct link is in the chat. That is a great spot to get information about the working draft of the HCP, about what's coming up. And please, please do encourage everybody you know to join that email list. Because that's a big way of how we let folks know when something is going on. With that, we greatly appreciate you all being here tonight. Thank you again, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks all.